Good morning, family. Good to see everybody out this morning. Especially thankful to have our visitors here. This is your weekly reminder that at the Marshfield Church of Christ, we are committed to glorifying God and uplifting one another through worship, spiritual growth, outreach, fellowship, and service to the community. We believe that mission is accomplished by loving God and by loving each other. I invite you to become part of that mission if you don't have a church home. And I know several, particularly Trey, it's good to see you here. Hopefully you'll be here more often in the near future. Whenever we read this account, this has sometimes been called the Sermon on the Plain, to contrast the Sermon on the Mount. If you read Matthew 5 through 7, you're going to see very similar topics discussed there. We could probably do an entire series of sermons just from the first 4 verses that we had Jake read this morning. We're going to try to cover some highlights from this particular passage. You notice that I've got a few things up there. We're actually going to skip over most of the parts about loving your neighbor, just because that in and of itself could be its own sermon series. But one thing I would like to talk about, because this is something that I have been told has been taught as an alleged contradiction, is this particular sermon and not necessarily some discrepancies, but some slight differences that we see between it and Matthew 5. So the first one is where did this take place? Now, I'm of the opinion, and this is the opinion of a gentleman named D.A. Carson, if you want to look that up, the term level place, that does not necessitate a plain. We call it the Sermon on the Plain because we've done that forever. It never actually calls it the Sermon on the Mount. It says that he went up to a mountain. So Sermon on the Plain, Sermon on the Mount, it's faster to refer to it that way. What I think this is if you were preaching in the mountains, you probably wouldn't have people sit on the crags. You'd probably find a spot where everybody could actually sit down, which would be a level place. So probably both of these are reference to the same thing. We could call them both the Sermon on the Plateau, would probably be accurate in my opinion. Either way, that doesn't necessitate that this necessarily was even the same speech. The discourses are similar, but I can tell you, any good preacher knows that any sermon that's worth preaching once is worth preaching twice, especially if you're going somewhere else and you want to skip some preparation. So that's the first thing I'd like to point out. So there's no necessary discrepancy between the two. The other part of this really comes from the first in this list of Beatitudes, is its slight difference between it and how it's recorded in the book of Matthew. So here it's blessed are the poor. In Matthew's account, you may remember that it's blessed are the poor in spirit. Now, it sounds like either somebody's misquoting somebody somewhere, because that is a fairly different meaning if you take it on face value. So, here's why. You may not realize it, and we don't think about it this way. Whenever we read the gospel accounts, we really are reading a translation of what actually transpired. Most of Jesus' speeches would not have been given in Greek, which they're recorded in. They would have in all likelihood been given in either Aramaic or possibly Hebrew. And if you look back at the Aramaic language, lo and behold, the word there that would be the word for poor can mean either a spiritual thing or a monetary thing. So what we have recorded, maybe not interpretation is the best word, but it's a connotation that each of them are trying to pick up on. I personally think this is because of Luke's audience. Whenever you compare the first century church in Palestine versus the first century church that Luke would have been primarily writing to, they would have been, his audience, Luke's audience, would have probably been more financially blessed than the one that Matthew is writing to. And Luke is trying to warn them of the dangers that comes with that. So, continuing on with that thought, nobody gets the hashtag woed. We got a lot of hashtag blessed, but Luke has both of them mentioned here, right? So we see this set up as two parallel things. You have a blessing in the beginning, and then there is a comparative and parallel woe for each one of these. Now, if you read this carefully, you're going to notice that the first one of these is a present thing. Yours is, or theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the rest of these are things that are talking about now versus the future. Whenever we think of people who are impoverished, we have to remember that the things that were going on in the first century are a little bit different than what we face today. We live in what we call a free market economy or a capitalist economy. That's not exactly true, okay? Back then, they lived in a true free market. That means that if you made money, you got money. If your goods and services were worth something, you got it. And if they didn't, you didn't. Here we have a bit of a safety net. If anybody remembers there was a few people who were there for the actual lecture, but I gave a sermon the following Sunday on the rich young ruler and how wealth in those days isn't exactly the same as wealth today. Because if you take all wealth into consideration, just by living in the United States, you're in about the top 15 to 20% in the world. So we would be wealthy by comparison. Back then, and some people still believe this now, there was this idea of an absolute amount of good that could go around. And that by somebody being blessed more than others, it necessitated that somebody else wasn't blessed as much. So that there was this one piece of the pie, and that by somebody getting a bigger slice, that meant, in order for that to be taking place, somebody had to lose some of theirs. The wealthy in Jesus' time, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, did not acquire that by means that were necessarily moral. There is some degree of that still happens today, but the corruption is not near to that level. I did read an interesting article, though, in preparation for this. It was Psychology Today back in 2010. They had done something called a meta-analysis. That's where they look at all the data and try to get it down to what does the data as a whole say. And generally, it showed that people who had been impoverished were more generous than those who weren't. The interesting thing to me is the ones who are the most greedy were the ones who had never been in a situation where they were impoverished. People who had gained money throughout their life, who had at one point not been wealthy, were just as likely as those who weren't very wealthy to give money. But if you've never understood what it's like to be poor, you generally aren't generous. This was the more interesting one to me. In 2017, they took a group of people, both who were impoverished and those who were wealthy, and I don't know if you've read a lot of psychology studies. They're a little fuzzy, especially compared to the medical stuff, but they had these people imagine, the people who are poor, imagine that they were wealthy. They had them do some visualization exercises, and they had rich people do the same thing the other way around. They had them visualize what it was like. They showed them some pictures of what it was like to be poor. And then they gave them this test about how much they were willing to give. They did one before and one after. And it turns out that by identifying with being poor, you are more likely to give more money. Now, like I said, not a very technical study, but it does, to me, bring something to mind. Whenever you had the first century church, and the church here in present day America even, we need to be with our brothers and sisters in Christ. And we need to develop empathy for those who are in need. Because unless we are with them, unless we see the types of things they have to go through, we are never going to develop the type of empathy that's necessary to give generously the way that God commands. Because if you notice, we have the blessing here. Verse 24, "Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation." For those of you who are in class this morning, we talked a little bit about this, how if you don't have something to look forward to in heaven, there's no real reason for you to act any differently than you currently act. If you think that the world that you're in right now is the best it can get, God doesn't have anything to offer you. And there's some people who live that way, where they've already obtained the reward. Going back to verse 21, "Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when you're excluded, and revile you, and spurn your name as evil, on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day, and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven, for so their fathers did the prophets." And the corresponding woes, "Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when people speak well of you, for their fathers did so to the false prophets." The entire gestalt of what Luke is trying to point out here is whenever you're looking at now and not caring about what things are going to be in the future, you live your life in a different way than if you were looking to the future. This theme's going to come back in a little bit. When you live for the day and don't live for the future, you start having problems. I'm not sure who this is original to, but you've probably heard this before. Sin will take more than it ever gives. It'll go farther than you ever expected it to, and the joys will be shorter than you ever expected them to be. It's a short-term result with long-term consequences. Why do you think there's so much debt in this country today? Why do you think there's so many problems going on with people? I had a patient a few days ago, died of a car accident. Now, there's a question of was there alcohol involved? We don't really know that. But he was trying to pass in a no-passing zone so he could get somewhere faster. If you think about it, that's sort of the mentality that a lot of Americans have adopted. Immediate gratification. Heaven is the ultimate delayed gratification. You ever thought about that? You will virtually have no real physical thing to hold on to of heaven in the future. But the joys that we receive now is what Luke is talking about whenever he says yours is the kingdom of heaven. It's a current phenomenon. It's something that we realize now, but will have its ultimate realization in the future whenever we join Jesus. Continuing on, if you'll skip down with me to verse 39. He also told them a parable. Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Why do you then see the speck that is in your brother's eye, and do not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, Brother, let me take that speck that is in your own eye when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye. You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. I've mentioned this before. The word hypocrite never actually had a negative connotation until Jesus used it that way. It was just a word that basically meant somebody who was in a play, an actor. It wasn't until Jesus used it in this way before it gained something bad associated with it. You're acting like something you're not. Jesus here talks about the idea of the reformer, which in general is a good thing, right? He mentions here this person is wanting to fix a problem. If you go back through the Bible, this is generally a good thing, right? You have the reforms of people like Josiah, Hezekiah. Isaiah, in a way, had reforms. You see the reforms seen by Ezra and Nehemiah. If you think about it, whenever Moses originally gave the law, that was a reform of how the people had been living their whole lives. If you look back through history, I think that the fact that Martin Luther said, hey, we've got problems here, is actually one of the most important turning points in history. But, there's always a but. Whenever you don't see clearly, whenever you don't actually realize what you're trying to do, you're not able to figure out what the real problem is. I use Martin Luther as an example. He thought that the problem was people charging for admission into heaven, basically. That was really the basis of his decisions. He wasn't wrong, but he didn't clearly see that that wasn't the only problem. It went deeper than that, because he had those same biases in his brain that kept him from being able to see things clearly. Whenever we try to do things for the community, whenever we try to reach out to people, we need to make sure that we understand what the actual problem is before we go saying, if we would just fix this, then we'd be better. If we would just take away that, we'd be able to do outreach, we'd be able to grow the church, we'd be able to do the things that God wants us to do. Because before that, he talks about, well, if you can't see, you're going to lead somebody astray. A couple weeks ago, we were in Des Moines. We have a friend there. His name's Bill. Bill was born blind. And whenever I was preparing for this lesson this week, I couldn't think of something that somebody did that was kind of funny. We were talking to Bill. Bill sticks out his hand to shake my hand. And one of our friends named Sam comes around and shakes his hand. Bill's there saying, "It's so good to see you, Quentin." And we had to point out to him, it wasn't my hand that he was shaking. One of the most dangerous things about being blind is you can't necessarily tell whenever you're doing something because of your blindness. You have to have the self-awareness to realize that you're blind. Jesus encourages us to examine ourselves before we start making any type of reforms. Before we start saying this is the way that things need to be, we need to look at ourselves. James isn't here, but James knows one song, and that's The Wise Man. He knows how to hit his hands together, and he knows how to go, oh, that's his two things that he knows how to do. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from this, aren't there? I, over this past week, had to do some foundation, I don't know. The foundation itself is more or less fine, except for a couple of cracks in it. where water's coming up through the floor. And the sump pump went out while we were gone, so I ended up with a wet basement. When the foundation isn't quite the way it's supposed to be, the whole house starts having problems. Now, there's a lot of things that we can take from this particular parable. I think there's some that are in the immediate context demanded, and I think there's some that we can learn from. The first one, and it's kind of going back to what we saw in the Beatitudes, there needs to be some degree of concern for the future before you start building now. Why would you build a house without a foundation? Complete ignorance, I guess, would be one answer. But the primary reason is because you haven't taken the time and don't have the patience to actually lay the foundation the way that it should be. Now, in the immediate context, if you look back, Jesus is using this in relationship with verse 47 there at the end. The one who comes to me and hears my words and does them. Building a foundation has to do with, in this particular situation, putting the words of Christ into action. The illustration he's trying to draw is not so much the impatience, but the main thing he's trying to draw from is building a house, or listening to his word, is like building a house with a foundation. It's like following the instructions. We could say the foolish man is the one who got all the parts to his shelf out and didn't decide to look at the way the instructions said, and at the end wound up with extra pieces. You're not supposed to have extra pieces. You might later have what one may describe as the book avalanche. I don't know if you ever had a bookshelf break on you. It makes a very interesting sound and scares your dog. The words that Jesus had for people, and really the entire idea behind this, is you need to prepare things, get the foundation right, get the bad things out, so that whenever you decide to start walking in the kingdom life, you'll be able to do it to the best of your ability and the way Jesus wants you to. So what does that look like? Sometimes that means getting rid of something sinful in your life. There are some things that they're sin. God can't have anything to do with them. I will tell you, those are usually the things that are obvious to people. Those are the things that they realize they need to lay aside. And those are, a lot of times, the logs that are less difficult to see. Other times, it's things that may not apparently be something you struggle with, and they may not even necessarily be sinful, but they're things that get in the way. When we go back to the first beatitude listed here, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor." The first woe is woe to the rich. Is money evil? No. The love of money is. Money itself is amoral. But when we think back to the rich young man, the rich young man had a lot of wealth, and it was something that gave him some degree of comfort. It was something that gave him some degree of confidence. And even though the wealth itself wasn't necessarily evil, the way that it affected him was. Is there something in your life this morning that may not necessarily even be wrong, but it's taking away from you being able to do the things that you need to for the kingdom. Sometimes a hobby, when it becomes an obsession, while not inherently bad, gets in the way of our time with God. Are you having to look at your different things that you like to do and make decisions on your schedule based upon, do I want to do what God wants me to do, or do I want to do something that I want to? We talked this morning a little bit about Satan's tools. I'm convinced that for most Christians, faithful Christians, Satan's strongest tools are not the ones where threatening somebody with alcohol who's never had a drink. I personally don't think that's a temptation for most people who don't have a problem with that. That's not a good temptation. Keeping you busy, giving you a lot of activities, giving you a lot of things that don't necessarily jerk you away from the church, but slowly draw you away, so that even when you're in the pew, you're not actually in church. Those are the most dangerous tools that Satan has. This morning, I encourage you, as the Hebrew writer recommended, to lay aside every weight and sin that so easily besets us, so that we can run with endurance the race that is set before us. Are you running that race this morning? If not, please come as together we stand and as we sing.